welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're exploring a really complex and, well, often challenging history. It's about the interaction between European settlers and the native peoples in North America and Australia.
Yeah, it's a huge story of change, displacement, colliding worldviews, really, all happening within that context of what people at the time called modernization.
And guiding us through this, we've got a collection of sources, texts, timelines, maps, images. They lay out these histories, often from quite different angles.
Exactly. And look, given how sensitive this topic is, the historical trauma involved, we should probably state upfront. We're impartially looking at the content and perspectives in these specific sources.
Right.
We're trying to understand the period as presented here, not endorsing any particular viewpoint or action described.
Absolutely. Our mission is just to unpack this material, get to the core insights it offers about, the forces at work, and hear some of the voices that come through, both European and native.
Sounds good. So where do we start?
Let's set the stage.
Yeah.
European expansion.
Okay, so from the 17th century onwards, European expansion really kicks into a higher gear, moving beyond those earlier Spanish and Portuguese efforts in South America.
Yeah, other countries get heavily involved.
Right. France, Holland, England. They're extending trade, setting up colonies, America, Africa, Asia.
And the sources point out different kinds of colonial control, don't they? It wasn't all the same.
No, definitely not. The material makes some clear distinctions. You had trading companies like the East India Company in South Asia, which started with trade but eventually became political powers, even annexing territory.
Then there's the more direct approach.
Yeah, direct imperial control. Like the British in India, they took over but often kind of kept the local administrative structures running just under their command.
And then there's a third way mention, like in China.
Exactly, where multiple European powers, and Japan too, were deeply involved in internal affairs, exploiting resources, but without ever formally taking over the whole state. The sources call these semi-colonies. Sovereignty was seriously compromised.
Okay, but our focus today, based on the material, is specifically on settler colonies.
Right. And what makes these different, according to the sources, is that Europeans came to live permanently, not just trade or rule temporarily.
So people putting down roots.
Yeah. The material gives examples like the Dutch in South Africa, the British in Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, and of course, various European groups in America.
And a key thing the sources note about these settler colonies, English becomes the official language.
Mostly, yes. Although it does mention French is also official in Canada, a bilingual case there.
Now, this whole period, the expansion, the settlement,
Yeah.
the sources place it within a bigger context, right? Modernization.
It's linked to huge changes back in Europe, the Industrial Revolution, political revolutions, ideas about turning subjects into citizens.
But it's not presented as just one single path to being modern.
No, the sources are careful about that. They point out that different societies develop their own kinds of modernity. Japan, China, Taiwan, South Korea are mentioned as examples, distinct paths.
Okay, so within that frame, what's the core conflict when settlers meet native peoples?
Well, it becomes clear pretty fast in the material. There's this fundamental clash. The sources talk about the European settlers' bourgeois mentality.
Yeah.
This deep idea of buying and selling everything.
Yeah.
Land, water, resources. It's all commodifiable.
And that clashes directly with native perspectives. There's that amazing quote in the sources attributed to Chief Seattle.
Yeah. If you do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can one buy them? It really cuts to the heart of it.
It does.
Because the sources explain native peoples didn't operate on that idea of owning land or fish or animals in the same way.
How did they operate then?
Their economies, as described here, often revolved around exchange, but as gifts, reciprocity, not purely commercial transactions. The material calls it competing notions of civilization.
Wow. That difference. Understanding land, ownership, it feels like the absolute key to everything that happens next.
It really does.
So let's dive deeper into that, starting with North America, based on what the sources tell us.
Okay. North America. The material gives a good sense of the geography. It's vast, incredibly varied. Arctic Circle down to the Tropic of Cancer, Pacific across to the Atlantic.
Mountains, plains.
You've got the Rockies, the Great Plains, the Great Lakes system, those huge river valleys like the Mississippi and Ohio, the Appalachians. It's immense.
And resources, too. Oil, gas, minerals, forests.
Yeah, rich in natural resources.
Yeah.
And the sources make a point that the huge farming and fishing industries we see today, mostly developed in the last 200 years by immigrants.
Right. Before that, you have the native peoples.
Yeah.
And their history goes way back.
Way back. The material says over 30,000 years, people arriving from Asia, likely across the Bering Straits land bridge.
And the oldest artifact found.
An arrow point, dated around 11,000 years old. And there was a big population jump around 5,000 years ago, the sources note.
And what about their traditional way of life as described in these sources?
It paints a picture of people living in bands, or maybe small villages, usually along rivers. They ate fish, meat, and cultivated some vegetables, maize.
They hunted bison too, right?
Yes, especially on the plains. And that apparently became easier once they got horses, which came via Spanish settlers from the 17th century onwards.
But a key point seems to be how they hunted and farmed.
Exactly. The material stresses they generally only killed what they needed. They didn't practice large-scale agriculture aimed at creating a big surplus.
And the implication is?
Well, the sources suggest this might be why they didn't develop those large kingdoms or empires you saw further south in Central and South America. Owning or controlling vast tracts of land just wasn't the main focus.
They were content living from the land, not necessarily owning it in the European sense.
That seems to be the core idea presented. Food and shelter from the land was enough.
And their culture. What do the sources highlight?
Things like formal alliances, friendships, gift exchange being really important for how goods moved between groups. Numerous spoken languages, though the sources note they weren't written down. History and knowledge passed down orally. They apparently had a concept of cyclical time, not linear.
And skilled craftspeople.
Oh yes, weaving beautiful textiles. And this fascinating ability the sources mention being able to read the land. Understanding climates, landscapes, almost like literate people read written texts.
The sources also touch on the names used for native peoples.
Yeah, it lists quite a few. American Indian, First Nations peoples, Native American, Indigenous people, and unfortunately the outdated term Red Indian is also mentioned as having been used.
It is strange how some tribal names ended up on, cars or places completely unconnected. Dakota, Cherokee, Pontiac.
It is a bit odd, yeah. Mohawk.
So, when Europeans first arrived, we're talking traders, 17th century North Coast. What was the initial interaction like, according to the sources?
Generally described as friendly and welcoming initially. The natives were expert hunters, which was valuable for the Europeans interested in furs and fish.
These weren't the Spanish looking for gold further south.
No, the focus here, initially at least, was trade.
And what did the Europeans trade?
Well, useful things like blankets, iron pots, guns, but also, crucially, alcohol. And the sources are pretty direct here. They say natives became addicted, and this gave Europeans leverage to dictate trade terms.
A two-way street of addiction, though.
Interestingly, yes. The Europeans apparently got hooked on tobacco, which they got from the natives.
And how did they see each other? Mutual perceptions.
Predictably, often based on different value systems, the European idea of civilized involved literacy, organized religion, cities.
Things the native societies didn't generally have in the same way.
Right. So the common European view was often that natives were uncivilized. Though the sources mention contrasting European ideas too, like Rousseau's noble savage idea or Wordsworth maybe having a less romantic view of their imagination.
But there were other perspectives, people who actually spent time with them.
Yes, the material brings in Washington Irving, for example. He apparently observed they weren't quiet or taciturn among themselves. They mimicked the white newcomers and were genuinely puzzled, even saddened, by European greed.
Worried about the beaver slaughter, fearing animal revenge?
Yeah, and apparently their own folktales sometimes mock European greed and, well, dishonesty. The sources also mention a Hopi prophecy, seeing the Spanish arriving like turtles, offering a trinket instead of a proper handshake, which was seen as a bad omen.
But immediate cultural misunderstanding.
Right from the start.
Okay, so after the traders come the settlers, from the 17th century on. Who were they, according to the sources?
A real mix. Some were Europeans fleeing persecution back home, younger sons of landowners who wouldn't inherit, looking for their own land, immigrants from Germany, Sweden, Italy, Poland, many wanting to establish farms.
And they brought tools.
Iron tools, yeah. Ready to clear the forests, which were vast, and turn them into farmland.
And this is where that fundamental difference in how they saw the land really becomes a major issue.
Absolutely. The material makes this crystal clear. Natives saw and understood the existing landscape, the forests, the tracks. Europeans often saw potential cornfields, land not being productively used in their eyes.
So, empty land, ripe for taking.
Essentially, the sources even quote Thomas Jefferson referring to natives as uncivilized because they didn't farm for profit or own land in the way he understood it. And disturbingly, mentioning his view that this unfortunate race have justified extermination.
That's quite stark.
It is, and the impact on the landscape was huge. Huge areas cleared for farms, wild animals, wolves, mountain lions seen as threats to livestock, hunted, often to extinction in many areas.
And fences go up.
Yeah, the invention of barbed wire in 1873 gets a mention, a tool for enclosing land, marking ownership very visibly.
So displacement wasn't accidental. It became systematic.
It seems so. The sources describe natives being pressured, sometimes forced, to move west. They'd sign treaties.
But the treaties weren't always fair.
Often not, according to the material. Low prices paid for land, outright cheating, taking more land than agreed, paying less.
And the justification used.
Often framed as natives not deserving land they weren't using to its maximum potential, sometimes called lazy. There was even this awful idea, mentioned in the sources, linking the fate of natives to the fate of the bison.
That quote about primitive man will disappear with a primitive animal.
Yes, referencing the near extermination of the bison by the 1890s. A really bleak outlook promoted by some.
Where were they moved to?
Reservations, often small areas, frequently land the settlers didn't want, and sometimes areas with no historical connection for the people being moved there.
Forcing different groups together.
Yeah, sometimes forcing tribes who might have been rivals to share the same small reservation, which inevitably led to more conflict.
Was there resistance?
Oh, definitely. The sources mention the U.S. Army crushing rebellions between 1865 and 1890, and in Canada, the Métis people revolted in 1869 and again in 1885.
But the outcome?
Ultimately, the military power of the expanding states was overwhelming.
The sources include some demographic data comparing the U.S. in 1820 to Spanish America in 1800. What does that show?
It shows a really stark difference. In the U.S. by 1820, the proportion of the population that was native was tiny compared to the white and mixed European black populations. In Spanish America around 1800, native and mixed populations were still the vast majority.
So it highlights the sheer scale of displacement and population decline in North America's settler colonies compared to elsewhere.
It really does. It underscores that specific impact. The material also mentions anthropology emerging as a field around the 1840s.
Studying these differences.
Often, yes. Framing it as primitive native communities versus civilized European ones. Some anthropologists at the time even predicted that native peoples would just, die out.
Grim. Okay, besides farming, what else drove this westward expansion?
Gold. The California gold rush in the 1840s is a major event highlighted in the sources.
Right, thousands heading west, hoping to strike it rich.
Exactly. And that boom fueled the need for better transportation, leading to the massive project of building transcontinental railways.
Connecting the coasts.
Yeah, the U.S. line was completed by 1870, Canada's by 1885. The sources mention thousands of Chinese workers were recruited, often under harsh conditions, to build these railways.
There's a quote from Andrew Carnegie.
Yeah, comparing the speed of American progress to Europe, saying the Republic thunders on at the speed of an express, captures that sense of rapid, unstoppable expansion.
And industrialization in North America took a specific form.
Yes. The sources contrast it with England, where industry grew partly from displaced peasants moving to factories. In North America, industry developed heavily around supporting that expansion, building the railways, manufacturing the machinery needed for huge farms.
Leading to very rapid economic growth.
Phenomenal growth. The sources state the USA went from being relatively undeveloped economically in 1860 to being the world's leading industrial power by 1890, a massive transformation in just 30 years.
And by 1892,
the sources say the continental expansion was basically done. The U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. No more vast tracts of empty land pulling settlers west in the same way.
And almost immediately, the U.S. itself starts acting like an imperial power.
Seems so. The sources mention setting up colonies soon after, in places like Hawaii and the Philippines.
Okay, let's shift gear a bit. Moving into the 20th century, the focus changes towards rights, recognition.
Yes, the narrative shifts. Though the sources point out that initially the U.S. Constitution's ideals, democratic spirit, right to property, they mainly applied to white men.
But there's that interesting counterpoint mentioned. Daniel Paul's idea.
Yeah, that Thomas Paine, one of the big thinkers behind European democratic ideas, actually used Indian societies as a kind of model, suggesting they, in a way, planted some seeds for European democracy.
Fascinating thought. But despite that, conditions for native peoples were still pretty bad for a long time.
Very bad. The sources suggest real change started gathering pace around the 1920s. A key moment seems to be the Lewis-Merriam survey in 1928.
What did that find?
It exposed just how poor the conditions were on reservations, health, education, everything. Really dire.
And this had an impact.
It seems to have sparked more awareness and sympathy among some white Americans, a sense that natives were being denied the benefits of citizenship while also being pressured to give up their own cultures.
Leading to actual legislation?
Yes, like the Indian Reorganization Act in the U.S. in 1934. It gave native peoples on reservations certain rights, like the right to buy land, take out loans, trying to provide some economic tools.
But then things shifted again in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, the policy pendulum swung back. The sources describe attempts by both the U.S. and Canadian governments to end those special provisions. The goal was assimilation, encouraging natives to join the mainstream.
Which essentially meant
Adopting European culture completely, abandoning their own traditions and ways of life.
but native peoples pushed back.
They did, actively. The sources mentioned their Declaration of Indian Rights in the U.S. in 1954. They accepted U.S. citizenship, but insisted on keeping their reservations and traditions.
And in Canada.
Similar story. Strong opposition in 1969 when the government proposed removing specific Aboriginal rights from the Constitution. They fought to keep them recognized.
And this long struggle eventually led to major legal changes.
Yes. The sources highlight Canada's Constitution Act of 1982 as a key moment. It formally accepted existing Aboriginal and treaty rights.
Still being worked out, but a fundamental recognition.
Exactly. The details are complex and ongoing, but the material shows that Native peoples in both countries, despite everything, have managed to assert their rights to their cultures, their sacred lands, in ways that would have been unthinkable a century before.
Okay, let's take that understanding now and shift our focus across the Pacific.
Yeah.
To Australia. How does the story compare, according to these sources?
Well, Australia has an even deeper human history. The sources say people arrived over 40,000 years ago, maybe even earlier, likely from New Guinea.
And their own understanding of their origins.
A core concept mentioned is the dream time. It's described as encompassing this tradition of always having been there. It's complex, apparently blending past and present in a way that's often hard for Europeans to grasp.
How many distinct groups were there originally?
The sources estimate between 350 and 750 native communities, each with its own language, though sadly only about 200 of those languages are still spoken today.
And the Torres Strait Islanders.
Mentioned as a distinct group, yes. Together, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people made up about 2.4% of Australia's population in 2005, according to the figures given.
Geographically, Australia is huge, but mostly empty.
Very sparsely populated overall. Most towns are on the coast, which is where the British first landed. The center is largely arid desert.
European arrival, Dutch sightings early on, but the key moment for British settlement.
James Cook, 1770, reaching Botany Bay, claiming the east coast for Britain, naming it New South Wales.
And then the penal colony.
Yes, established in 1788. The sources really emphasize that these first settlers were convicts. Once they served their time, they were often allowed to stay.
And their attitude to land.
Having nowhere else to go, the material suggests they just felt no hesitation about pushing natives off the land to start farms. The sources draw a parallel to how convicts were used earlier in Brazil and some American colonies.
Initial interactions. Friendly at first.
Cook's crew reported friendliness initially, yes, but the sources note a sharp turnaround after Cook himself was killed later in Hawaii. That event was apparently then used to justify violence against other native peoples elsewhere, including Australia. Sort of a hardening of attitudes.
Here's a powerful description from the Sydney area, 1790, from the native perspective.
Yes, from the Durick people. Their whole way of life, food gathering, was totally disrupted by the British arrival described as 1,000 hungry mouths.
They saw destruction.
Destruction of sacred places, strange behavior like cutting down trees without any reason, building these big, unwieldy structures that could make sense of it.
They thought it was a ceremony and stayed away.
Initially, maybe.
Yeah.
But the British interpreted that avoidance as abandonment of the land, which then, shockingly, led to official orders for kidnapping Aboriginal people.
And the overall impact on the native population.
Just devastating. The sources state nearly 90% died.
90%.
Yes. From diseases they had no immunity to, loss of land and food sources, and direct violence in battles with settlers. It's an almost unimaginable mortality rate.
Economic development in Australia under the British. How did it compare to North America?
Less varied, according to the material, really focused heavily on huge sheep farms. Wool was massive, plus mining stations, vineyards later on, and wheat farming. That became the bedrock of Australian prosperity.
The suggested capital name, Wool Wheat Gold.
Yes. Apparently that was seriously suggested in 1911. Shows where the economic priorities lay. They chose Canberra instead, which ironically perhaps is derived from a native word for meeting place.
Were native people used for labor?
Sometimes, yes, and the sources say often under very harsh conditions, almost like slavery. Later, like in California, Chinese immigrants were brought in for cheap labor.
But that caused unease.
Yeah, among the white population. The sources mention governments in both the U.S. and Australia eventually banned Chinese immigration, and Australia specifically adopted the White Australia policy.
Which lasted a long time.
Right up until 1974, explicitly designed to keep non-white people out.
Now, a really crucial difference from North America mentioned in the sources is how land was taken.
Yes, this is key. The Australian government legally classified the land as terra nullius,
Meaning?
belonging to nobody. So, unlike the US, Canada, or New Zealand, where there were at least treaties signed, however flawed or unfair they often were, in Australia, there was initially no formal process, no treaties made with the native inhabitants at all. The land was simply considered empty and available.
But things started to change later on. Winds of change in the 60s and 70s.
They did. The sources point to W.E.H. Stanner's 1968 lecture, The Great Australian Silence, as a really important moment.
What was the silence?
He was talking about how Australian historians had largely just ignored the Aboriginal experience, written it out of the national story.
And that sparked a shift.
It seems so. The sources describe a growing interest from the 1970s onwards in understanding Native peoples not just as, museum exhibits, but as living communities.
With distinct cultures.
Exactly. Unique cultures, deep knowledge of the land and climate, strong community bonds, rich oral traditions, amazing art, deserving respect and understanding.
Figures like Henry Reynolds asking, why weren't we told?
Yeah, directly challenging that dominant historical narrative that effectively began Australian history with Captain Cook's arrival, ignoring the tens of thousands of years before.
And this led to actual changes.
Institutional changes, yes. The sources mention universities setting up departments for Native studies, galleries dedicated to Native art, museums expanding their focus, and really importantly, Native people themselves starting to write and publish their own histories, their life stories.
Seen as vital for preserving cultures.
Absolutely. And alongside this, Australia officially adopted multiculturalism as a policy in 1974. The idea was to give equal respect to Native cultures and the cultures of immigrants.
The sources also mentioned the impact of the broader human rights discourse from the 70s.
Yes, that global focus on human rights seemed to highlight the injustice in Australia, particularly the lack of treaties and the ongoing disadvantages faced by Aboriginal people. The poet Judith Wright is mentioned as someone who championed their rights and wrote about the losses they endured.
And there was that specific, painful history of the stolen generations.
Yes, the sources address this directly. The long-standing practice of forcibly removing children of mixed Aboriginal and European descent from their families, trying to assimilate them into white society.
Decades of activism and inquiries eventually led to significant steps.
They did. The sources highlight the growing recognition of the deep historical connection Aboriginal people have to their land, its sacredness to them.
And the apology.
A major step, a formal public apology by the government for the injustices done to the stolen generations, marked by a National Sorry Day in 1999, acknowledging the harm caused to children taken from the 1820s right through to the 1970s.
And then the Mabo decision.
Huge legal landmark. In 1992, the High Court of Australia, in the Mabo case, ruled that terra nullius was legally invalid.
Overturning that original justification.
Exactly. It finally recognized that native land claims existed before 1770 and could still exist. A fundamental shift in the legal landscape.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together now. We've looked at North America, we've looked at Australia. Based on this deep dive into the sources, what are the big takeaways? Shared experiences, different paths?
Well, the most obvious shared experiences, tragically, the profound disruption and displacement European settlement caused. Massive population decline among native peoples in both places.
Yeah, that comes through loud and clear.
And in both continents, the sources clearly show that fundamental clash of worldviews we talked about earlier over land, ownership, production, what civilization even means.
And economic drivers were central in both stories, weren't they?
Absolutely. Whether it was the gold rush and farming driving expansion in North America, or the massive sheep stations and mining in Australia, the demand for land and resources was relentless and directly impacted Native communities.
Accelerating displacement.
Definitely. And another clear parallel the sources reveal is the long, hard struggle by Native peoples themselves for recognition. Recognition of their rights, their cultures, and acknowledgement of the historical injustices.
With major legal and policy shifts really only gaining traction in the latter half of the 20th century in both cases.
That's right. It's been a long road.
So this exploration of the sources, it really lays bare the devastating impact of European settlement on indigenous peoples across both continents. That clash of worldview seems so central. And then the long, difficult journey towards acknowledging that history and those rights.
And it really makes you think about that question raised in the source material itself. What do we actually mean when we talk about the mainstream? How much is that shaped, maybe unconsciously, by economic and political power? Who gets to define what's dominant?
That's a powerful point. And thinking about that, how do these histories, these stories of displacement, these competing ideas about land, identity, how society should work, how do they continue to shape countries like the U.S., Canada, Australia today?
Right. And how do they influence the ongoing relationships, which are still evolving between the state and indigenous peoples?
It's definitely something to reflect on. The legacies of these paths to modernization are clearly still with us.